Greetings, lovers of lore! Thank you for joining me for the second installment of the Brothers' War story. In the first installment, Takasia, along with the brothers Urza and Mishra, were able to locate and rebuild a Thran ornithopter. Using this ornithopter, they discovered a possible ancient Thran site marked out in the desert. It was surrounded by gigantic symbols of animals, humanoids, and zagging lines. Our story continues with the brothers and Takasia having made their way out to this site. After investigation, the site did indeed turn out to be a Thran location. In the center of all of these symbols, they found a large mound. When they started to excavate the mound, they started to find artifacts. And at first, they were small things, a piece of an ornithopter, things along those lines. But as they progressed, bigger things started to appear, including an almost fully intact Su Chi. Takasia was very excited about that, as she had been trying to piece one together for years. And even more impressively, there was a good number of damaged ornithopters here. Knowing what they knew now, it would take them little work to make these ornithopters operational. But the greatest discovery was a considerable number of Thran power stones that had been buried here. Many of them were broken, but there were still more than enough for the camp's needs. Some of the stones were shipped back to Penregon, garnering more interest in Takasia's work from the city's nobility. There were enough riches found in the desert mound that Takasia was able to establish a second permanent encampment located by the mound. Since this successful expedition had paid off so well, they started a full campaign of aerial scouting to locate more of these mounds, and a familiar pattern started to emerge. Each mound was surrounded by a pattern of twisting lines, and over the next 2 years, 20 different mounds were located, each one offering up more artifacts and power stones. But still no artwork, and barely any scraps of language, and no physical remains at all of the Thran's bodies. It was Urza who ultimately puzzled out that the lines around the mounds were directions. He realized that the drawings out in the desert may just be the Thran cataloging beings they had encountered. Over dinner, he explained to Takasia and Mishra. Pulling out a map, he started to mark off the mounds they had already discovered. As he did so, he explained, the drawings out in the desert weren't art. What we need to focus on is the lines around them. They actually point in particular directions. And as he was saying this, Urza drew a line through all the mounds that they had already found. It formed a circle. Then he drew lines extending from each mound in the direction indicated by the Thran's marking, and each line led to the center of the circle. Urza put his finger in the circle's center. Here is where we will find a major Thran burial site. Mishra snorted in disbelief. Urza quirked a little smile. I'm going tomorrow to investigate. I take it you don't want to come along. Without waiting for a response, Urza turned to Takasia. I asked permission to take an ornithopter to this location tomorrow. Hold on, interjected Mishra. I'm going as well to make sure you aren't making all of this up. Takasia couldn't help but notice that even though the boys had grown up, Urza with his smooth face and thinner frame, Mishra even stockier and sporting a new beard, they were still the same two boys at heart squabbling with each other. She nodded her assent, and Urza departed to make plans for the journey. A few moments later, Mishra left as well to speak to the Falaji diggers. His face was troubled. Takasia finished her meal and headed back to her tent, eager to study the Su Chi further. Musing to herself, the legs bend backwards. She found it remarkable. These musings were interrupted by someone coming inside her tent. It was old Amal. Takasia really liked his grandfatherly nature and his honest character. But something was wrong. She could see it in his face. I heard about the expedition tomorrow, he said. Takasia wondered how he already knew, but it only took her a moment to realize it had to have been Mishra, asking Amal about the ruins. She invited him to sit, and he did so, nodding gratefully. Takasia proceeded to explain Urza's discovery to Amal. Concern creased Amal's face. This is unwise. You will rile up the Falaji. Takasia was genuinely surprised by this. Everywhere I've been, your people have been welcoming and more than willing to trade in Thran artifacts. Amal said, most Philagi are modern thinkers, but a good deal of my people believe the spirits of the Thran reside in the mountains. The desert belongs to anyone who can survive there, but the mountains are holy lands, not to be trifled with lightly. Takasia was plaintive. Amal, you know quite well there's no way for me to stop them from going. But now that I understand the situation, I will accompany them to ensure that everything goes smoothly. Despite his misgivings, Amal agreed to help the expedition if necessary, and to bring with him only those Philagi who would not be insulted by what they were doing. The expedition embarked the next morning. Takasia and the two brothers headed off in the ornithopter they had originally built. It had been upgraded with enough space for all three of them and their supplies to rest comfortably. Mishra and Urza took turns flying the ornithopter, each taking a shift of 4 hours. They flew above the desert, then some wastelands, over sandstone canyons, and the landscape continued to change beneath them. While Urza flew, they moved like an arrow directly towards the target. When Mishra took control, however, things were less orderly. Mishra would zag around to look at formations of interest that lay below them. But anytime that he veered too much off course, Urza would call out to him, and with a sigh, Mishra got them back on course. They flew for an entire day and spent the night sheltered in the ornithopter atop a cliff. The brothers were no worse for wear, but Takasia's age made it a real trial for her. They ate cold rations for breakfast and continued onwards. Once they finally reached the mountains where the Thran encampment was located, they immediately spotted their goal. Broken buildings dotted the landscape, featuring architecture of ranging styles, and there were giant metallic worm-like structures and what appeared to be broken bronze creatures. All of these wonders were half submerged in sand that had been blown out from the desert. Urza looked over at Mishra triumphantly. "Do you believe me now?" A giant grin creased Mishra's face as he smiled back at Urza, excitement dancing in his eyes. "Well done, brother!" Takasia looked around, taking everything in. "The Thran's secret heart," she said softly. Urza picked up on what she was saying. The old Argivian word for secret is koilos, the perfect name for this place. Out of nowhere, a giant shadow fell over the ornithopter. Mishra slammed the ornithopter downwards, his instincts saving them all as a giant rock dove through the air directly where the ornithopter had been moments ago. The thing was huge, bigger than most rocks Takasia had ever seen. This massive bird could easily pick up a horse in each of its deadly talons. Mishra shouted out, "It's too fast for us!" as the dangerous beast wheeled through the air, preparing to make another pass at the ornithopter. The atmosphere inside the ornithopter was tense. The barely averted rock attack had rattled both the brothers and Takasia. They were scrambling for answers. Urza yelled tersely, "Why is this thing charging at us?" as the rock flew upwards, recovering altitude from its failed dive. Takasia hazarded a guess. Most likely it believes us to be another rock. The ornithopter is rather large and currently airborne. It most likely considers us a rival trying to steal territory. While Urza and Takasia were trying to puzzle out the rock's intentions, Mishra frantically yanked on the ornithopter's control levers. "We aren't going to be able to get higher than it." There was fear evident in his voice as the rock rose directly above the ornithopter and barreled down into another dangerous dive. Mishra adjusted the wings and banked in a rightwards direction, but it was no use. The rock had anticipated this move and also headed rightward. A massive talon ripped into one of the right wing struts, heavily damaging it. Takasia's face was grim. There would be no outpacing the rock now. Mishra bellowed over the noise of the attack. "We will never outmaneuver it now. We need to land." He frenetically worked the ornithopter's controls, trying to shake off the rock. At that point, Urza spotted a hole in a cliffside. "Take us there, brother," he pointed. Mishra shook his head. "We'll never make it. I can't shake the blasted thing." Urza wasted no time in shoving Mishra from the controls. "You fly like a bird, playing the rock's game, but it's far more experienced at being a bird than you. Fly it like the device it is, and we have a chance." True to his words, Urza guided the craft in a direct line towards the cliffside, accelerating in a downwards fashion. The rock's primitive bird brain was fundamentally unprepared to deal with this surprising flight pattern that no natural creature would use. As a result, it hung in the air for precious moments while it tried to figure out what to do next. Those moments were enough for Urza, and he hurtled the Ornithopter top speed towards the cliffside. Mishra started to yell fearfully about slamming into the cliff, while Takasia, on the other hand, was quietly murmuring a prayer she had learned as a little girl. They both let out their breath when Urza abruptly yanked back on the controls, causing the Ornithopter to pull back, and at the same time, he unlocked the wings. This caused them to pull back against the sides of the craft. The Ornithopter plummeted immediately, and not a moment too soon, as the rock had caught up to them, and the only thing that saved them at that moment was falling out of the rock's reach. Once Urza judged they were clear of the rock, he re-engaged the wings, slowing the Ornithopter's fall just enough that they were able to land safely, if not gently, in the sand. Takasia stared upwards out of the Ornithopter's hatch. That rock hasn't given up on us. We need to get out of here. Urza looked at the damage to the craft, specifically noting the strut, and turned to Mishra. Brother, are you hurt? Like you care, Mishra's rage flared. I could have saved us. I didn't need you butting in. Urza's eyes narrowed. Your method of flight is flawed. We only lost it because Enough! Cut in and exhausted Takasia. We need shelter. Gather up supplies quickly. Food, water, and torches. The brothers quickly grabbed what they would need, their feet hastened by the looming shadow of the rock. It was back. Fortunately, they were also close to the hole in the cliffside. From the shelter inside, they could see the rock circling, waiting. So they headed inwards, and as they went further in, the rough natural stone walls started to change to worked granite, smooth to the touch. Takasia was astounded. Even with the fitful light provided by the flickering torches, she could see this was far beyond any Thran site she had ever encountered. We're lucky you spotted this place. Urza placidly denied it, saying, the location here was evident based on the position of the outlying wreckage. We now stand in the Thran's secret heart. Mishra spoke half-awed. Nothing lives here. There's so much dust, but there are no tracks but our own. The brothers turned as one to Takasia, seeking guidance. We stay close together and don't wander from the path, she said. Together they headed off. They passed by stairs leading off in other directions, but no one wanted to take them. Finally, they came across a stairway spiraling downwards into the unfathomable darkness. They paused in stunned silence. There was a thrumming emanating from the stones. It was palpable, the kind of thrumming you both hear and feel deep in your bones. This was something ancient and powerful. Urza and Mishra locked eyes. Then as one, they turned to Takasia with resolute looks on their faces. She nodded, and so the three descended. Off in the distance, there was a small, dull light. The light grew in intensity as they traveled towards it. When they finally reached the source of that light, they beheld something of true wonder. The chamber they entered blazed with light. Crystal ceiling plates illuminated everything. Even more amazing were the constructs that lined the walls. No broken down wrecks. These machines all seemed to be in perfect condition. Their metal plates burnished and shining. Glistening oil was evident on their joints. It was almost like the Thran never left. Everything felt new and well cared for. It was incredible to behold. But above everything else in the chamber, their attention was drawn to a majestic power stone. It was perfection, sharp and sleek. A myriad of colors crawled along its surface constantly. This was the source of the thrumming they had felt. This close to the stone, it was a constant beat. Takasia's mind likened it to the beating of twin hearts. The stone sat atop a platform surrounded by mirrors. In front of the power stone sat what looked like a giant book, only it was made of metal and glass. Urza and Mishra surged forwards with keen interest. Upon closer inspection, the book appeared to be open, and incandescent runes glowed invitingly. "This looks like the Thran writing, but more complicated." Takasia quietly spoke. "This may have been the peak of Thran society, so far advanced from what we found in the desert." Mishra's eyes sparkled with excitement, and he reached a hesitant hand towards the book. Urza was immediately there blocking Mishra with his arm, so it was impossible to say which of them touched the runes. But waves of intense light billowed outwards from where they stood as the Power Stone was torn asunder. The Great Thran crystal cracked in half, releasing a massive wave of force. Takasia saw Urza and Mishra slammed into the ground as an explosion erupted. The heat was intense, and the force of the blast left her on her knees, blinded by the light that had blasted forth from the damaged Power Stone. Something happened in that instant. Both Urza and Mishra experienced incredible visions. Urza was soaring through the sky, his body airy and insubstantial. But he paid it no mind. His attention was raptly fixed on the landscape set out before him. The land below appeared to be made out of giant metal cables woven together. They were flaking with rust and punctuated by an occasional massive gear. These gears inched around laboriously, struggling against the woven cables. All across the landscape, Urza could see loose cables were moving of their own accord, like large metallic snakes, weaving themselves into the ground. Urza flew down to get a better look, landing on a nearby gear. The entire place had an interesting semblance of life to it. Urza rode the gear as it carried him into a storm, and this storm was just as odd as everything else in this strange place. It started to rain on Urza, and he noted with curiosity that the rain was actually lukewarm oil. The gear continued onwards, carrying Urza out of the storm. Unexpectedly, the ground gave way as an imposing metallic tower burst upwards. The sounds of tearing metal and snapping cables were resounding. Glyphs on the metal plates of the tower glowed, and then Urza was carried upwards as the giant gear soared in the air. It was then that he noticed a similar gear with the first people he had seen in this place. These people were dressed all in white, including matching masks. They seemed to be assembling something. It was at that moment it dawned on Urza that he might be in a dream. The gear he was on grew closer to the figures in white, and he could see what they were building. He could see they were building a giant bronze spider that resembled the wreckage they found outside of the cave. As Urza stared at the hulking metallic spider, he started to grasp how it moved, as well as how to power such a device. He felt a pulsing from deep within himself. Looking down, he saw a colorful glow. It was emanating from within his body. Tentatively, Urza reached into his own chest cavity and drew forth the source of that light. It was a large gemstone with one ragged edge. Colors danced across the surface of it through a distinctive pattern of white, blue, red, green, and black. Finally, the destination he was headed to appeared. A giant foundry with a fascinating furnace built in the shape of a grotesque face. As they grew closer, Urza noticed there were more groups of people and more constructs flying by. Spiders were joined by oxen and giant metal men, huge metal minotaurs, and other interesting creations. The gears came to rest at the base of the foundry, and all of the constructs moved off in orderly lines. The figures in white started to move in a far less orderly fashion up a ramp towards the open mouth of the furnace. They moved slowly in a way that Urza interpreted as reluctance. One of the figures tried to turn back and was instantly obliterated by a blast of light fired by the spider they themselves had helped to build. Urza was perplexed. This is madness. All that remained of the white-robed figure were his smoking bones. Urza's attention was drawn back to the top of the ramp, where white-robed figures were bursting into flame due to the extreme heat pouring from the furnace. Still, even on fire, they trudged forwards to fling themselves into the furnace's hungry maw. Urza heard screaming and realized it was coming from his own mouth. He wrenched his eyes shut against the horror, And then suddenly, instead of the furnace's stifling heat, he felt cold stone below him as he awoke on the chamber floor. Mishra found himself in a bizarre hallway, the walls made of a dark leather reminiscent of sand lizard skin. When he touched them, they pulsed as if they were alive. The hallway extended infinitely in both directions. As soon as he took his first step, he heard a crunch and felt something hard under his boot. Upon inspection, he found it was a tiny golden man. He thought absently of Urza and Takasia. They should see this. And then he noticed that he had broken off one of the man's limbs, and the little figure's face was frozen in a scream. Mishra looked back down at the floor. Every inch was covered with tiny golden figures of elves, humans, dwarves, and even minotaurs. He tried to step gingerly at first, but noticed that every figure was screaming regardless of whether he made contact with it or not. At that point, he plowed forward. He was unconcerned now that he considered them to be just toys. As he progressed down the hallway, alcoves started to appear. Each one had a mirror set in it. Mishra peered into the first mirror he encountered. In the mirror was a man, but the figure shifted forms, switching from elf to dwarf, minotaur to human, goblin, and more. Mishra stood transfixed, watching long enough to determine a pattern to its multitudinous mimicry. It was constructed of some strange stone. The second mirror in the hall held a different shapeshifter. This one had armored plates. An understanding came to him as he stared into the mirror. The devices back in the cave were meant to shape flesh, metal, and stone, to improve them. Energized by his realization, he hurried to the next mirror. Another stone shapeshifter. This one with giant horns, but they were reversed. And this one also had bones that protruded visibly. Its skin was different than the previous shapeshifters he had seen as well. This one had a leathery-like aspect to it. In the final mirror, Mishra found a feral-looking creature. Its skin matched the walls of the hallway, inky black and leather rough. Dark bones jutted from its body. Giant antelope horns, these too were backwards, sat atop a thin bestial face with impossibly sharp-looking teeth. Red copper coils fell across the creature's face. They were lodged in its head. Mishra waited expectantly, but the form remained motionless with its eyes closed and did not shift to another form. After a considerable amount of time inspecting the reflection, Mishra was surprised when the statue opened its eyes. He took a step back as if to leave. The statue's eyes were decidedly alive, and blood was seeping out around their edges. Mishra realized this was no reflection, but a living being, and one that could see him. The dark beast raised its hand to its chest, indicating. Mishra placed his own hand in a similar position and felt something other than himself. There, in the middle of his chest, sat a gemstone. Colors glittered along it. Mishra grabbed the gemstone and pulled it from his chest. It felt right in his hand, but something was missing. Turning it over in his hands, he could see the scar where the stone had been separated. Mishra looked back up, and the creature had placed its hand up against the mirror. Mishra reached his hand towards the mirror. As he got closer, the leathery fiend started to smile. Then Mishra heard his name being called. He spun around and white light consumed him. That light was replaced by the light inside the cavern as Mishra found himself on the chamber's floor. Time moved differently inside the brothers' visions. They awoke only moments after losing consciousness. Takasia had not moved more than a few steps towards them before they were awake and getting to their feet, each holding their half of the Great Thran Power Stone. Takasia noted that inexplicably, the Power Stone halves were glowing with power. Every other Power Stone she had ever seen stopped functioning if it got cracked with even a hairline fracture. Somehow, Urza's stone flared with a crimson essence, while Mishra's stone pulsed with emerald energy. Urza immediately moved to make sure his brother was okay, but Mishra weakly waved him off. The brothers immediately set to arguing about who was to blame for what had just occurred. but Takasia quickly stopped. In the distance was a rhythmic tapping cadence, one that seemed to be increasing in intensity moment by moment. It was the sound of metallic feet slamming into the ground, lots of metallic feet, and it wouldn't take long before they arrived. All right, my friends, that ends this installment of the Brothers War lore. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you appreciate what we're doing on this channel and want to support the lore, then join our Patreon or the channel membership. Thanks for coming by. I will see you all for the next lore video. And remember, my friends, lore is life.